Welcome to The Nation. I'm Jessie CHAHAL. Joining me today is AMIR ABDUL RAHIM, Managing Director of Impossible Solutions, Sindhya and Berhad. At a time when democracies around the world are under strain, and from widening generational divides and digital manipulation to growing distrust in institutions, questions are now being raised about whether Malaysia's democratic system is prepared for the challenges ahead. And today we want to discuss future-proofing Malaysia's democracy. What is putting it at risk? What recent reform signals mean? And what must be done to ensure it remains inclusive, credible and resilient for future generations? Well, this is The Nation. Welcome, Amir. Thanks for being with us. Of course, it's good to have you here for a discussion that is not just timely, but one that really sets the tone for a year ahead, a brand new year ahead. As we discuss Malaysia and her democracy, what is at risk today than it has been since a decade ago?
Yeah. Thanks for having me again, Jessie. I guess today, some things we have to acknowledge as truth. And this is affecting every sphere of public policy, including this particular issue. Malaysia is aging. And this is not a Malaysia phenomena, it's a global phenomena. What this means is that at some point, I believe it's 2049 now by those Department Statistics, latest statistics, Malaysia's population will peak. And from there, it will decline. Already in terms of aging, I think we will hit about 15%, 14-15% aging at about the same time there. So what you're seeing is that people are living longer and having less children. So there will be a generational divide. Today's generation, we're seeing at least 3 to 4 generations in the same window. So they each have their own different needs, different wants, and when they're not heard, or when the system works against them, that's what you see globally as the Gen Z uprisings that are coming. That's the first trend. The second trend is how we perceive information is changing. How we get information is changing. AI is now at the forefront. We're getting more and flooded with more and more data and new videos, new information generated by AI content, which could be malicious, could be just a reframing of different things. And this flood of information, you can already see it with distrust. I think somebody in India resurrected their dead father, who was the former MP, to campaign for him in an election. There's just one example of this. And of course, Malaysia, we've seen even our own PM had AI fake images of him coming out. There was even an AI attempt at extortion of a few of our MPs, including YB Rafizi, I think last year. So you can see these things are changing the dynamics of our democracy and how it has to be able to function.
From the outside looking in and as an observer, what are some of the key points you're concerned about as you assess how Malaysia's democracy is evolving?
So I think we're not doing enough to make room for every generation and every segment group so that they feel heard. So I think immediate, you can already see the number of women, for example, in our parliament is abysmal compared to the population. They're 50% of the population. Yet I believe they're only about 10-15% of parliament, of Dewan Rakyat. So the numbers speaks for themselves. I think even in the Sabah election, I think less than 5 women were appointed to the ABDUL from the many seats that were contested. So you can already see that. The next more immediate one is maybe youth. You can already see below 40, let's not even talk about the 30, which is the new definition that starts this year. Below 40, how many of our MPs are actually that? And it's not to say that give these people a handout or a say, but you're talking about decisions being made at the level where these people might not even live to see the consequences of some of the decisions that are being made. Yeah. And that being said, it's also important to note that for the previous generation, they came to power, or they had the opportunities at about that age, at about mid-30s, 40s, was where the full stride was. So if you look at, for example, the average age of deputy ministers back in the 80s, 90s, they were all among the 30s, 40s. Today, they're 50s, 60s. It's a little bit better with the latest government, but not by much.
Okay. Well, as we assess that and we look, what is your assessment of Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim's recent announcements? He did put his foot firmly down to say that he's in favour of the Prime Minister only being in power or in office for 2 terms.
So I should credit where credit is due. Honestly, I felt that wasn't going to happen because they mentioned that was part of the manifesto long back. So the election has been over for almost 2 years now, and there was no news about it. So credit where credit is due. The fact that they're committing to that sends a strong message. I do have some concerns now that we move towards limiting a prime minister's term to only 2 terms, i.e. he or she can only be, I have to say she, because that's possible.
Of course, thank you for that.
He or she can only be around for 10 years maximum, raises then this question of how strong will our politicians be? How credible will our politicians be in pushing reforms? Because there's two ways to look at it. On one hand, there'll be more legacy-based because now they're only there for 10 years. So it's not about wealth concentration or collection. But on the other hand, you could also make the argument then, how about protections to push reforms? So I'm very curious to see whether we would introduce similar mechanisms, not just for Prime Minister, but for ministers, for MPs, for civil service. And a lot of people don't talk about this, but civil servants wield incredible power at the ministerial level. So how are we controlling some of those things? That's for the 10-year PM limit. I believe he also announced right to know, the ombudsman. That's fantastic. I think it's a good way forward. The separation of powers between Attorney General as well as the Director of Public Prosecutions now, I think that's a fantastic way forward. But again, what are the safeguards to ensure that these individuals then don't abuse that power? How do we remove them? How do we keep them? These are all questions that must be addressed in the bill that they want to table, I believe in January. I think that's what they said, right?
What are some suggestions that you could put forward at this point as we debate and talk about this?
Like I said, I think in order to do more, it's not just about these 3 things that the PM has announced for governance reforms. I think we should do more. I think some people are not going to like this idea because Malaysia has struggled with the word quota for a while. But I genuinely believe that if you want to see a more diverse candidate base at Parliament, you should introduce candidate diversity quotas at the nomination level. Force every single political party to nominate 30% women out of all the candidates that they feel in a general election. 10% youth out of all the candidates that they feel. They may win, they may lose. So you might not get 30% women in Parliament or 10% youth in Parliament.
But at least those doors are open for the possibility.
And if there is any political party president today that wants to say, I don't have 30% women that are credible from my women's wing, I think they're shooting themselves in the foot. Because we all know the women's wing is probably what's keeping a lot of these political parties afloat.
Point. Now, we talk about the youth segment and we talk about Malaysia as well being an aging nation. What would you say or pitch in about bridging this gap between the younger generation, the older generation, whatever you want to call it, Gen Y, Boomers, Gen Z, Gen Z?
I think ultimately it's not about one generation over the other. Like I said, I think every generation grew up at different times and have different lived experiences. Therefore, they would have different wants. Like, I think I always hear some people lament I remember talking to some of the politicians. For example, some people lament, why don't they remember what we did for them throughout the years? But you're talking about something you did during their grandfather's time, and it's now become the norm today. You can't expect people to still retain the same appreciation.
So that one-size-fits-all mold cannot work anymore and isn't basically something that works further. What can be done then in that aspect for us to motivate and inspire this change? Because we talk about this and it's great in theory, it's great in the notes, but it's hard to see movement. It's hard to see those barriers being broken.
Well, that's why some of the reforms I'm suggesting, one of it is candidate diversity. I think we really should measure the performance of our MPs. We need to go beyond attendance at Parliament And even then, we don't really track it as a performance metric. It's just something Parliament tracks. But even then, you're there 10 minutes, you're considered there the whole day. Let's be very frank. Then we need to see how many debates do people actually participate in. Let's put our MPs to task and give the political party presidents some data to who to choose. So it's not really just about who's strong in the party, but who's actually performing in Parliament.
Okay, what would you say about the Prime Minister's recent reshuffle? He had moved around a few of this portfolios and profiles. What would you say about that? Because could that be indicative of a movement to ensure that there's smoother progress and more achievable targets that are being met?
Well, if you ask me, I would argue that it was timely because, again, some portfolios have been sitting empty with the resignation of some of the other ministers, with some ministers ending their senatorship. So there needs to be a renewal. Is that the best renewal, best formula? It really depends on how they perform. I don't want to prejudge some of the decisions.
And so that's why, and again, you may underscore the fact that a proper metric or measurement system is required. It does seem, though, that after all these years, surely there is something that is working, that's in place. Or do you beg to differ?
To be honest, I don't think there's anything institutionally. I could be wrong. I'm more than happy if somebody can correct me on this. But as far as I know, there's nothing institutionally there. It's really up to the political party leaderships as to whether they think this person is performing or not, whether they get a second shot at general elections. I would even argue, so one way we can diversify our pool base, and it doesn't even have to be age or gender based. We could even just simply say, in one parliamentary constituency, the same person cannot be the member of parliament twice. So after that, we don't have to limit the period. He or she can just move to a different parliamentary and see if you win there.
Right.
Then you can continue to serve. That way we renew the pool base. Because I think the diversity within what the options we have for cabinet, the diversity in what we have in MP, to make sure that all the generational voices are raised, is what's needed.
Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit earlier about AI and deep fakes happening to the Prime Minister and few other ministers as well, locally and internationally. So to touch on that point in terms of risks, how can we protect the integrity, say, of the GE when that comes around against the deep fakes and the evolution of AI?
So this is where I believe we really need to evolve some of our laws. Among the things we can consider, Singapore has a model whereby they outlaw certain usage of AI and deepfake during the election period. So they took a measured response, as opposed to outright bans, as opposed to total cut. They just do it during the election period. Mm-hmm. So there are certain things you cannot do. And not so much as they disable. That's part of the problem. The thing about AI, digital, it's all the big tech companies that are controlling it. It's not as easy. Like even today, Malaysia just made an announcement that disabling Grok. But how effective is that when people can bypass it with VPN, with a lot of other things? And even at that same time, how are you controlling what is still being produced by the big tech? Some of these big techs have yearly revenues that dwarfs our GDP. How do we even control that? So that requires a multilateral approach. But coming back to the original suggestion, we should consider how our election laws regulate AI content during that period, ban it. We should also consider, I think we are supposed to have an AI governance act sometime in Parliament. I think the Ministry of Digital is working on it. But we need something that forces people to label AI content. Let people know that the thing that they're seeing is fake. If not, how would you know? But even then, I would argue enforcement is going to be very difficult because it's big tech. I think more importantly and more immediate, how do we get our people to realize what is fake? So the Nordic countries, the Scandinavian countries, they're incorporating it within their syllabus, not a new subject, but as part of identification of fake news or fake AI content. It's part of their syllabus now. I think we need to start looking at some of those options so that people realize not just at children's level, even the elderly, even the youth, even the middle, they realize how to spot some of these fakes, how to question what's put before them and say, oh, maybe I better double check this before I forward this on my WhatsApp.
Absolutely, that's quite important at this point of time in terms of equipping ourselves with that knowledge to differentiate between what is fake and what is real. If these reforms that we've spoken about and some of which you've shared isn't implemented soon or takes too long to come around, what do you think would be the risk for Malaysia as a nation in terms of our stability?
Honestly, like any country, when the system does not make room for a large segment of society, and this does not need to be a minority, this does not need to be a majority, because those are, I think, the typical cards that are usually played when these conversations come in, the race card. But regardless whether it's race, whether it's youth, whether it's gender, if a large segment of a population don't feel heard, and they feel that the system does not give them that room, or the system is rigged against them, and this doesn't apply just to government, this also applies to organizations. For example, I'm a founding member of JESSY Against Genocide, which is a group that's advocating that the International Law Student Society, which organized the biggest mooting competition in the world, address a double standard where they acted on Russia for their actions in Ukraine within 14 days, but till today, for 2 years, nothing on Palestine. Yet, for over a year, they've not said anything to us, or rather, when we interact with them, they gaslight us. So we are now, some of my founding members are saying we should be more radical. So that's what might happen if we don't make room within our democratically elected systems. If we don't make room, we will see what happened in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, happen here. Mm-hmm. Yeah? That is really the risk. If you really make it hard for people to get their views out, you run the risk of uprising.
Is this also an issue that borders the understanding of one's culture and that exchange? Is that something that is at play here when you talk about this example that you've given about the Law Society and the mooting?
I think that's just an example of a system that tries to close legitimate questions on actions that they do. Within a Malaysian or governmental context, I think we're more talking about opportunities for people to be able to respond, or for people to participate in the governance of their country. If really we make it that difficult and all the policy is skewed to elderly, you will also see a brain drain scenario. If I can't move up the ranks, for example, and I've talked about this as well, if I can't move up the ranks here because retirement age is increased without certain limitations on positions that the elderly held, why am I still in Malaysia if somebody in Portugal or in Arab, where they're also facing aging issues, is now offering me better positions, better benefits? I'll just move there.
Right, which comes to the point of the Undi 18. That was a major milestone, but you argue that this is only the beginning. We're only scratching the surface. What structural barriers are still limiting youth's influence in national decision making?
A seat at the table. That's it. A seat at the table, because ultimately there's now a lot of things that are being done. Oh, we hear you, we want to hear from you, but are they actually the ones there? Are they actually the ones making the decisions, being able, besides contributing views, which is questionable whether or not it gets heard, do they influence anything beyond that?
I hear you say all of this, and I can't help but to come towards an idea of the fact that maybe what you're trying to also suggest is that we need to have not just a structural change, but a deep cleansing and a replenishment of our system. Is that something you would agree with?
To a certain extent, yes, because it's really about, again, you need diversity of ideas, you need people who will be able to move with the times. And to be very clear, I'm not saying that the elderly can't do that. I'm saying that you need to bridge across all the generations that exist today to get a better perspective.
Mm-hmm. We talked about, and you've also proposed reforms such as term limits for MPs and ministers to be performance-based for their accountability as well as diversity. Which would deliver the fastest impact if we're going to hit the ground running for these changes and this refresher, so to say? which would be or would have the fastest impact?
Honestly, if you ask me, they all have to go a little bit hand in hand, because again, these are all the same subject matter, electoral laws. So if you're going to amend it all one shot. So if you want to see fast change, general elections is in another two plus years. So immediately, if we can get that done, the term limits, the diversity limits, the diversity quotas on candidate nominations, you'll immediately see an effect. That will be the biggest, I think, the biggest and fastest. The other things on potentially MP performance, that should be done, but that may take a little bit more time.
As we look at Malaysia and democracy moving into a brand new year as well, what are the blind spots or the key areas that you think the Prime Minister and the others should come out and really start addressing? We've got the budget, we've got the subsidies, we've got the tariffs now, and all these things that are happening on the global stage, and then on one hand the war and so on and so forth, and sometimes a lot of our own issues, nation-based issues are not as prominent as the others. So how do you make sense of this?
Well, honestly, I think we're in for a very rough year. I mean, if we look globally, I think we're going to start to see the effects of more geopolitical tensions. We're going to start to see the effect of US changes in policy and how that affects us generally. I mean, we've seen what happened in Venezuela. It's already raising questions on legitimacy of international law. We've, of course, seen the silence and the damning silence of what's happening in Gaza and the occupied territories with the genocide. So you're already seeing a world where international law, rule-based order is degrading. That's going to be a challenge for us. Malaysia as well, we're entering the life cycle of the general elections. So for the next 2 years before general election happens, it's very unlikely very strong reforms will happen. I would even argue that in some ways the recent announcements is a push to win back certain segments of voters, which is fantastic. And that's what we need. We need our voters not to ensure that the right candidate is appointed every single time, but even if the wrong candidate is appointed, they would do the right thing.
That's powerful. At the same time, is that just an ideal way of looking at things?
Exactly why we need the systems, some of the reforms we talked about today in place for that to be able to happen.
What's your hope for Malaysia and her democracy moving forward in 2026?
For me, I hope we create a space where all of us could be heard, where all generations could be heard. Recently, this is going to be very controversial. Actually, I'm not sure if I should even be touching this topic. But we saw recently there was even that FMT that asked a very sensitive question. The FMT newscaster that asked a very sensitive question in a forum. And I strongly believe when you talk about racial relationships in Malaysia, that's the next big challenge. Like today, when you talk about Malays gave up so much, or your Chinese and Indians, you came from two, and then there was a social contract agreement when we form our constitution. Therefore, there are certain privileges afforded to Malay. All of that is historical context that's very true, very real. But there will need to be a very serious conversation as to how do we proceed moving forward.
How does it evolve?
Knowing that there are now generations of people who have been born and raised here. How do we balance the two? How do we balance the lack of socio-economical growth of certain segments, how they feel that has not happened the way it should have? How do we now balance other racial groups that then feel that, we've not gotten rich, not everybody in that racial group is exactly rich, but they're here, they're born here, there's only so long you can stomach an excuse of, you weren't originally from here. Then we need to balance that. I believe that's our next biggest challenge for Malaysia. I don't have the answers. I'm not claiming to cite one or the other. I don't think any one particular view is strong right now, but it's something we need to be mature enough to talk and develop.
Amir, thank you for your time here today. It has been an interesting conversation. Well, that brings us to the end of our discussion. The topic, future-proofing Malaysia's democracy. Many issues raised highlight the pressures facing democratic systems globally, as well as the importance of timely reforms that strengthen institutions, protect the electoral integrity, as well as to ensure participation across generations. I'm Jessie Chahal. Thank you for watching The Nation, and do join us again for more in-depth conversations on issues that truly matter.